looks like it's working. So getting back to where I was. Buddhadasa says that enlightened beings, you know, when they communicate with each other, they don't even necessarily need to use words. It might be just a facial gesture or a nod, or they'll twist language or use language in ways that we don't normally understand. Now, an ordinary person who doesn't have the perspective of enlightenment, listening to an enlightened being speak, will be confused. And it sort of reminds me of Plato's cave story, where Plato tries to say that the experience of the escaped prisoner in the outside world who's seen light and real ducks as opposed to wooden ducks or shadow ducks, he's trying to convey it to the prisoners, but they don't quite get it because it's a problem with language, right? Language is inherently misleading. That was a theme that we talked about last time we met, right? Because of this way that it divides things up. If things are not really divided up this way in reality, right, then language is a distortion. And that's pretty much what Buddhadasa's entire little three-page piece is about. But you're going to come upon this distinction in many different ways throughout the semester when we try to understand the sort of perspective that Buddhists have about ultimate reality. It's hard to wrap your mind around it because we're in conventional reality. We're in a conventional perspective, and our language is everyday people language, right? And so it's sort of, you know, in the Tao Te Ching, if you recall, the opening line was, spoken Tao is not the real Tao. And you might want to just substitute the word Dharma for Tao. This, the way things are, the spoken way. Words about the way things are not the way things are. It's not the same thing. The Tao Te Ching is trying to say that there's this same problem here between language and reality. Right? It's almost impossible to capture ultimate reality in conventional language. And that's why folks like Lao Tzu use this word, but ineffable. Ineffable. Which means unable to be described in language. Right? Radhakrishnan used the same word. A lot of people from all these different traditions use the same word. So now, let me go over here. Buddhadasa uses a nice analogy. With water. And let's just say all sorts of different contaminated or mixtures of water. Right? He says something like this. Imagine someone who didn't know, like maybe a few hundred years ago, that water in a stream and water in a lake and water in the ocean, you know, the ocean water is salty, water in a lake might be green and mucky, water in a river or a spring might be really clean and pure. All different kinds of water might think that they weren't really the same substance. Right? He says even sewer water or toilet water has water in it. What makes the water seem like something else is the other things that are in the water, right? Not the water itself, right? So he makes that analogy with religions. Right? Religions are all the same. They're all water. But they're mixed with all sorts of other different cultural, traditional belief systems and things like that, that arose from various different reasons throughout history based on different societies' experiences and struggles and myths and all that sort of thing, right? So, but really, it's just like water. Salt water, there's this kind of water, there's purified water, distilled water, boiled water, it's all water. River water, ocean water, right? It's all water, right? Same thing with religions. because of this same idea that the ultimate reality is one. Right? No matter what religion you go from, you'll find something like that. Right? But then he says, and the title of his article was No Religion. Right? So really, at the highest level of reality, there isn't really anything water. There's H2O. Water is really conventional language. We understand it. It's like the word one or non-duality, right? That would be something like water. When you say all religions are one, the experience of all of them is about the same one thing. It's like all the different kinds of water, there's still water, right? But technically, from the most enlightened perspective, from a scientist's point of view, water is conventional language. That's everyday language. That's people language, right? For that stuff that we drank, and we called it water, right? But then we found out really what it is just hydrogen and oxygen. 2 parts hydrogen, 1 part oxygen, joined a certain way. Electron bonds, right? That's what it really is, right? Water is just an everyday kind of concept. It's familiar. We use it. It makes sense to us. That's people language. When we say conventional, the name of this distinction here is conventional versus ultimate. Language is conventional. People have a convention, let's just say, right? And they all agree on certain things, like a constitutional convention. They sign the Constitution. This is going to be the laws of our land. They have a constitutional convention, a sit-down. Everybody comes together and agrees upon something, right? So that's the idea of conventional. Something being conventional means it's sort of like the way that everybody has agreed to do things, right? That's what the word conventional means. So language is entirely conventional in that regard, right? Speakers of the same language, what unites them is that they've all agreed that the word water refers to that stuff that we drink, right? Speakers of another language have a different convention, agua, right? Or whatever language it is, right? So that's a convention, it's an agreement among a group of people, right? But ultimately, that stuff that we call water and others call agua, this and that, really what it is this. It's 2 parts of hydrogen and 1 part oxygen. It's these little atoms forming a molecule. 1 molecule of water. And all those molecules put together. There's so many of them that have to be there before we can even see a dot of water. Right? But at the ultimate level of what really exists in reality, it's just hydrogen and oxygen. This is an important analogy because it plays a huge role in the philosophy of Buddhism. The philosophy of Buddhism is all about ultimate reality and conventional reality, right? So, to make the point, when he says, there is no religion, that's like saying there's really no water, there's only H2O, right? And what that means, what he's trying to convey is that at the ultimate level of truth, none of these words like religion, or the distinction between religion and non-religion, or he's religious, he's not religious, that sort of thing, it means nothing, right? Just like river water, ocean water, all that, you know, all that makes sense at a certain level, but ultimately it's just water, but even more ultimately it's just H2O. So in the world of Buddhism versus Islam and Christianity and Judaism, Buddhadasa is saying, yeah, they seem like different kinds of water, they were all kinds of religion, so they were all religion, they were all water, but ultimately it's just H2O, meaning it's not even water, it's not even religion, it's just what is, the Dharma. And that is beyond words. Right? So, that's the Buddhadasa argument. Let me pause for a minute. We have about 25 minutes left. We're going to end class a little early today. So those of you who need to speak to Janine, if you came in late, she's going to meet you between 12 and 12:30 in her office. Okay? 4 of you already have appointments with her, so the rest of you can go see her. All right, so any questions about this? No? All right, well, let me move on then and talk about the other fellow. This, by the way, for those of you who came in late, blackboard essay thing based on that, and the the Keown article that I'm going to discuss right now. All right. So Lloyd and others who just came in, I want you to know that if you came in today, you don't have to come in again on Thursday, and you won't be marked out. We're trying to be understanding this week with all the transportation problems. But the trade-off is, if you come in, you don't have to do the essay. But if you don't come in, you have to do a blackboard essay on this stuff. Okay? And anything that you missed, pay attention, because this is for you guys who came in late. Anything that you missed today, it's being recorded, so you can see what you missed online when you get home. All right? Okay, so now, let's switch over to talk about Damien Keown, the author of the chapter called Buddhism and Elephants, which is a funny chapter title. Damien Keown, Buddhism and Elephants. And this is a chapter from his book. Chapter 1 from the book, Buddhism, a very short introduction, which is a great little book. I've used it before. I'm not using it here. You guys have other work to do in this class. But I like this chapter because this is our first lecture on Buddhism, so I think this is appropriate. There's a story in Hinduism that this story, I think, predates Buddhism. By the way, Buddhism began with Buddha, of course, about 2,500, maybe 2,300, scholars disagree, years ago, in India. The part of India that is now separate and called Nepal. But Buddha was, a Hindu, and he was just like Arjuna, a Kshatriya, Kshatriya, a warrior, a prince by birth. All right? Buddha is a title, and it means awakened. They call him the Buddha. Buddhists don't call him Buddha, they call him the Buddha, the awakened one. In the book by Hess that you're reading in your English class, he's called the illustrious one, and other things like that. But Buddhists call him the Buddha. Not even Buddha, they call him the Buddha. Buddha. And it means the awakened one. Jesus?
Will there ever be like more than one Buddha?
Oh yeah, there are more than one. Technically, there's a distinction between a Buddha and what's called an Arhat, or an Arhant, depending on this Sanskrit and Pali distinction. All right? There's a very, very subtle distinction that only Buddhists really care about. And it goes like this. A Buddha is one who becomes enlightened on his own. And an Arhat is one who becomes enlightened. Period. And that typically, by following a Buddha, well, let's just say by following Buddhist teaching. Right? So, even though the Buddha said anybody can become enlightened, right? once there's a Buddha, it's sort of like the 10 monkeys or the 100 monkeys, what do they say? I forget how that goes. Like once anybody solves a certain kind of math problem, then people around the world can seem to solve it easier and quicker. Something like that. Like to be the first one in a universe that becomes enlightened without anybody who's your teacher who's already enlightened is a pretty big deal. Right? So that makes him sort of special among Buddhists. But once they've got his enlightenment and his teachings, they follow the teachings, they become enlightened. In Buddha's lifetime, I think Buddhist scriptures say, and I'll get to your question in a moment, Karina, that about 500 of his followers became enlightened in his lifetime. They were called arhats. Karina?
I was going to say, like, you know how it says Buddha becomes enlightened on his own?
Mm-hmm. Arhat.
Arhat.
It's like a saint. It's like a Buddhist thing.
By following, isn't the Buddha like also following, but they're just doing it on their own as well? Isn't it like kind of like almost the same?
Well, what it is it's sort of like this. If you figure out, right, like how to make the first bow and arrow, right, that's pretty cool. You invented it. And then everybody else can see your design and just copy it. Like you invent the recipe, and then everybody has your recipe.
So he like got it out.
Yeah, he wrote the recipe. Okay. Yeah, you know what I mean? But what's ironic about it, I mean, the Buddhists love the Buddha because he was the first one. But they don't believe that you have a soul. They believe that the ego is an illusion. He was just the first one to discover it. But so it's like they're not praising his ego or anything because they don't think he has one. It's kind of funny. Paradoxical thing. Okay, so I'm telling this story a little bit sideways, you know. First this, then that, and I probably should have started out with this story about the Buddha's life, but I think that I asked Joe Terry if he would, your other professor, if he would show you this film called The Buddha, His Life, or something like that, that I have. I put it in his mailbox. We talked about it. I don't know if he has anything else planned for tomorrow, but I think he might show it tomorrow. And so you're going to get a lot of that background on the history of the life of the Buddha by watching that film, and also some of the basic teachings of Buddhism. So we're just sort of dividing up the work a little bit in that way. But this thing about Buddhism and elephants, let's see how I could draw a bad elephant here. So we'll start with the trunk and some kind of big ear and some tusks. And something like that. The ears are a little messy, yeah. I don't know. All right. So there's my elephant, right? And then there's this story. Let's give the trunk a little length here, and a little opening there. There's a story in Hinduism, right, about like all these people around this elephant, you know, right? It's the 10 blind men, right? And the story goes like this. Imagine 10 blind men, each one of them stationed next to a different part of what we know to be an elephant, right? So the one holding the trunk would maybe say it's a snake. The one holding the tusk would say that it was like, you know, a harpoon. Or the one holding the leg might say it was a tree trunk, and so on, right? They would each have a radically different perspective. A radically different, but true perspective on the same reality. Right? Now, this story predates Hinduism. I'm sorry, predates Buddhism. This is an ancient Hindu story that Hindus used to use to talk about how Hinduism is one religion. Right? Because there's a belief in one God, right? In Hinduism, this would be God. God is the elephant. But like the different Hindu sects and everything. In Hinduism, this would be maybe Krishna, the leg, Shiva, the tail, what Brahman is the whole god, right? It's all Brahman, etc. That's the Hindu version of the story. But Keown, Damien Keown, he's a Buddhist scholar. He adopted this story to apply it to Buddhism, right? So let's just say that there's also the Buddhist version. Right? And in Buddhism, what you have is different sort of sects. Right? Or kinds of Buddhism. Right? So now we got this elephant doing two jobs, one in Hinduism and one in Buddhism. Because there are major different kinds of Buddhism that have evolved. And I guess now's the time for me to erase some space right here. There's the kind of original. This is from the Buddha himself. And there were many, like monastic communities, like monasteries and whatnot, that the Buddha initiated in his travels all around India in the sort of around 50 years of his life that after he became enlightened. Right, that he set up, right? And there's these turned into many different schools of thought, right? There's one surviving to this day, and it's called Theravada. That's a V, not an R. It's pronounced as if there's no H there, Theravada. And what this means is the way of the elders. It's the oldest living form of Buddhism. It's one of the original schools of thought. There were hundreds of them at the time. They're all very, very similar, right? This is the longest lasting one. It's still around. And Theravada Buddhism is alive all over Southeast Asia. In places like Burma, well, this is now called Myanmar, to Vietnam, and Sri Lanka, which used to be called Ceylon. But then, a few centuries after the Buddha's death, there was a kind of second wave of Buddhism inspired by a fellow named Nagarjuna. You see the name Arjuna in there, and Naga means snake. Snake Arjuna, or something like that. And he was a great philosopher. Some people considered a second Buddha. And this branch is called Mahayana. And Maha as in Mahatma Gandhi, right? Maha and Atman. Mahatma, for short. Mahatma Gandhi. Maha means great, like mega. And Atman, means soul. So Mahatma Gandhi, that's a title. His real name was Mohandas Gandhi. but they called him a great soul. He's a high being, a Mahatma, right? Like a saint, right? So Maha means great, and Yana means vehicle or way. A vehicle or a way, right? And like they named it this themselves.